All right, welcome everyone back to Miss Wright's Read Aloud. Again, reading the book Pax. We are getting to the end of our book. We're at chapter 27, and there are, I believe, 34 chapters in this book, so we are getting to the end. I will start with chapter 27 in this recording. And then we'll pick up with one last recording to finish the book, depending on when we get done here. All right, so we are at chapter 27. And in the last chapter, chapter 26, Peter had finally made it back to the old mill territory. He had convinced, kind of swindled that soldier into letting him in so that he could find Pax. And he was walking around the area near the old mill where there are army people and the camp is located. We're starting with Pax's story now. Chapter 27. Pax woke with a start. His boy was near. He jumped to his feet, waking Bristle, who had been dozing beside him, and began to search the clearing for Peter's scent. Nothing, but he was near. Pax bolted through the trees to the ridge above the encampment. He saw no youth among the war-sick. He did not hear Peter's voice among the murmurs and shouts. He crept down the hill and circled the camp as close as he dared, scenting from all directions. His boy was not there. But he was near, and he was coming. Pax returned to Bristle's side and lay down, but he did not sleep. Chapter 28. Peter traveled south for almost an hour, feeling certain that Pax had traveled along the same route. But when he emerged from the woods, he stopped. A vast meadow sloped down for at least a mile before flattening into another wide mile of wide green floor. At the base of that, the land rose hundreds of feet in jagged steps as if chopped with a giant hoe. And beyond that, rolling to the horizon, was the forested plateau that hid the gorge. Since waking, he traveled 9 hours without thinking of rest once, but now the stunning immensity of the distance ahead drained what was left of his energy. He dropped his pack and fell to the ground. 9 hours of gripping the crutch handles had stiffened his hands to claws. He forced them open and felt the raw palms split. They'd blistered the day before, broken open and blistered again. He poured cool water from his thermos over the hot bump of his palms and set to work to pick out the shreds of tire rubber. Then he eased his extra pair of socks over his hands and looked out again. A movement halfway down the valley caught his eye. Something trotted in bouncing dips between two trees. Fox movement. Peter rose to his knees. Pax! There it was again. But no, whatever there was tan, not red. Coyote, maybe. The thought was shot of adrenaline, and suddenly he was moving again, pack slamming against his back, crutches pistoning down all the way to the valley bottom in just a half hour, then sinking into the boggier ground there, muddy and slower, but still moving. And then a 10-foot sheer rock wall loomed in front of him. The cliffs were a lot taller than what they had appeared from across the valley. Before he could second-guess himself, Peter hurled his pack and then his crutches up and heard them clatter onto the stony edge. He wedged his fingers into a crevice and pulled. His cast scraped around the rough rock face. But his arms were strong from Vola's training, and he levered himself onto a shallow foothold. From there, he reached for a jutting tree, then another crack in the rock, and then he heaved himself over the first ledge. It took an hour to climb that stepped rise that way, crutches first, and pack first, and dragging himself after. When he reached the crest, panting and sweat-soaked, he fell to the ground under a tall pine. He drained his thermos in one swallow and ate the last of the ham sandwiches. He opened Vola's second packet. Peanut butter. Peter's throat closed. He remembered the first time Pax found an empty jar in the trash. He'd squeezed his snout in so deep it had gotten stuck, and Peter had laughed until it hurt. He stuffed the sandwich back into the bag, wishing he'd found it the day before, and tossed it to the dog scavenging the dumpsters, and got up again. It was almost 6 o'clock, and he had a ways to go still. As he traveled, the memories of those hungry-eyed animals accompanied him, darting and retreating like accusing ghosts. He wished he could tell them that he knew how it felt to have the one person who loved you and had taken care of you suddenly vanish. How the world suddenly seemed dangerous after that. He had lost a parent. How many kids this week, he wondered, had woken up to find the world's changed that way, their parents gone off to war, maybe never coming home? That was the worst, of course, but what about the smaller losses? How many kids missed their older brothers or sisters for months at a time? How many friends had had to say goodbye? How many kids went hungry? How many had had to move? How many pets had they had to leave behind to fend for themselves? And why didn't anyone count those things? People should tell the truth about war costs, Vola had said. Weren't those things the cost of war too? With a start, Peter found that the dark was falling around him. A little panicked, he should have been looking for a good place to settle the night. He spun around. His left crutch shot out onto a patch of loose stones. He fell onto it hard and heard a crisp snap. For an instant he feared, rib! But the sound had been wood. He landed, still gripping the top of the crutch. 6 feet away was its bottom shank. Dableman! It came out naturally, a satisfying word. He tried out some other swears, and they felt pretty good too. But the way the darkening woods absorbed his shouts without a response made him uneasy, so he stopped. He didn't have the luxury of venting anyway. He had a crutch to repair, and not much light left. All around him, trees shot out hardwood limbs that he could tape to the broken pieces as a splint. But he had no hatchet to cut them. As he drew the bat out of his back so he could find the tape, he realized that the solution was in his hand. He aligned the crutch pieces, laid the bat over them, and began winding the tape. When he was finished, he tested the crutch with his full weight. It held, strong and solid. He wished he could tell Vola she'd been right. He had needed the bat on his journey. He knelt by his pack again. The accident had been warning enough. He pulled out the things he needed to make camp for the night, then scraped a bowl in the dirt and filled it with a pile of twigs and dried grass. He touched a match to it, and a little fire crackled to life. Peter held his jackknife over the flames until he figured it was sterilized, then gritted his teeth and slit open the new blisters that had formed on his palms. The pain made him gasp, but he eased on some of Vola's salve and took deep breaths until it numbed. The herb smell swept him back to her kitchen with a rush, and he wondered if she was there now. How was she managing without that heavy leg to anchor her? Before he put his knife away, he held it up. The last of the firelight danced along its blade. He remembered the first time he'd seen Vola's knife, how shocked he'd been when she'd gouged a chip of wood off her leg. Peter tugged up his jeans. He pressed the flat of the knife against his calf and tried to imagine slicing off a nugget of flesh because it offended him, because it wasn't perfect. A coyote howled then, and a second answered from a distance. Peter shivered. He turned the blade until the cool edge creased his flesh and then jerked it up. The slice was only half an inch, but its sting was fierce. There were advantages, he could see, to being made of wood. The cut beaded up. As the dark blood began to drip, he drew it into the shape of a leaping fox. With his fingernail, he pricked out a pointed nose and 2 ears, a wild smear of his thumb for the brush. Pax, tomorrow. A red fox blood vow. Chapter 29. 3 mice swelled Pax's belly, and a muskrat dangled from his mouth, his first large prey. It would feed Bristle and Runt for the whole day. He craved sleep after a long night of hunting, but as usual he trotted along a weaving path home to confuse any possible predators. The trail the bleeding Runt had left when they'd moved was still strong enough to mark them as vulnerable. The first rays of the morning lit the grasses. A movement caught his eye. Bristle. She was a few full bounds out in the clearing ahead of that at the apron of the burrow where she usually guarded Runt. He watched her bounce up in mock alarm and then tumble kicking into the grass. Then he saw an even more surprising sight. Runt's small head bobbed up. Runt was outside, and he was playing. Pax dropped the muskrat. He called to Bristle, and Runt turned his head. Pax called again, testing, and Runt answered. He could hear. Pax was watched with a relief so overwhelming he could not move for a moment. Where he had once cared for only one boy, he now brimmed with love for this bristling vixen and her ragged brother, and they were safe. He streaked across the clearing. Bristle and Runt parted to welcome him into the space between them. He dropped onto his back, and Runt toppled onto him. Pax rolled Runt over gently, listening for any whimper of pain, and heard only purrs of delight. For an hour the foxes played. Runt rested often, and whenever he did, the other 2 stopped and flanked him. Like the buttercups beside them, their 3 fox faces lifted to the morning sun. Until Bristle leaped to her feet, nostrils flared. Pax smelled it too, the same threatening scent that had made him anxious for 2 days, but this was no longer a faint thread in the air. This odor was strong and growing stronger. Coyote! Bristle jumped toward the den, pivoted toward the clearing, and then jumped back to Runt. Pax had never seen her so panicked. At that instant, all 3 foxes perked their ears sharply to the same spot in the woods, to the careless branch rustling of a creature who did not need the advantage of stealth. Heading north, up from the gorge, heading for the clearing. The coyote was following Runt's trail. Bristle nosed her brother upright and screamed at Pax. Guard him! Pax herded Runt back into the den. Pacing the entrance, he watched Bristle head toward the rustling, stiff-legged and wary, and then stop. She pricked her ears, her rump high. And in the front of her, at the precise place where the junipers were still compressed from dragging Runt in, a dark, brindle coyote emerged, his head to the ground. Bristle barked. The coyote's head snapped up. Bristle barked again and jumped into the clearing. The coyote cocked his head and took a step forward to her. Then he lowered his nose to Runt's trail again. Deep instinct urged Pax to run away. The coyote was a tall, heavily muscled male. A fox was no match for an animal that large and aggressive. But a deeper instinct reminded him that Runt was defenseless in the burrow. Bristle ignored the instinct to flee as well. Instead, she tore straight towards the coyote, lunging at his flank. The coyote spun and snapped, just clipping Bristle's back foot. She limped into the clearing, whining as if she'd been injured. The coyote studied her, but then shook himself, recognizing the ploy, and dropped to the scent again. Bristle flew back. She jumped in front of the coyote's path and faced him, her spine arched. From her throat came a hoarse howl Pax had never heard before. For an instant the coyote pulled back, seeming surprised that the small fox was engaging him. Then he bunched his shoulders into attack position and bared his teeth. Pax's body stiffened. A growl rattled in his throat. Runt whimpered in the den. The coyote sprang at Bristle and knocked her to the ground. For a moment Pax saw nothing but fur and teeth flashing in the grass and heard only yips and growls. But then Bristle scrambled out of the coyote's hold. She leaped again toward the center of the clearing, a single leap only. Pax understood that she was luring him away from Runt. Staying just out of his reach, she baited the coyote until she reached the sweet gum tree. Then, just as Pax had done, she leaped up onto the slant of the trunk. She padded out onto the first low branch carefully, never taking her eyes off of the growling coyote who followed on the ground. When she reached the spot where the branch split, she was well over his head. She hissed a taunt. The coyote jumped. He clawed only bark and leaves. He circled in the hollow under the branch, looking for higher ground, and then jumped again. This time, his forepaws caught the branch and held for an instant before he fell back. He gathered himself and leaped again. Pax saw that Bristle was as far out on the limb as she could go. The coyote would tear her from the tree soon, or grow impatient with her distractions and return to the trail she diverted him from. She would follow and fight until he ripped her apart. "Stay," Pax ordered Runt, and he tore across the clearing. Chapter 30. Peter stared. There'd been a birch tree up by the upper walls of the mill. He and his friends had named it the Pirate Tree because in the fall, bright yellow leaves made it look covered in gold coins. He tied Pax to the trunk once when the kit hadn't liked their war play. The pirate tree was still standing, but now only blackened wisps tattered its branches. Nothing else, except the mill itself, was recognizable. All the trees in the lower field were gone, uprooted and blasted to splintered logs. Great patches of grasses around them were scorched to ash. The bank was littered with the crow-picked remains of perch and crayfish and turtles and frogs. What hurt most was to look at the water. The last time he'd been there, he dived into the pool beside the base of the gorge. The water had been so sparkling and clear that he'd been able to see the pale green shafts of the reeds, the iridescent scales on the trout, and even, when he looked up, the sheer blue nets of dragonfly wings skimming the surface. He might have been swimming through liquid diamonds. Now muddy boulders clogged the river, and the pool was a dull brown ring. The broad flat of the river was half its usual breadth. Mud flats near the banks, caking to dry clay, smelled of death. The water was what the whole war was about. Peter remembered Vola asking him which side his father was fighting on. Peter had answered her, stunned that she would even have to ask. "The right side," he added indignantly. "Boy," she had said, and then "boy" again, to make sure she had his attention. "Do you think anyone in the history of this world ever set out to fight for the wrong side?" The wind picked up and howled across the field, stirring eddies of ash. Peter tried to imagine playing here again. It would be a long time before anyone would ever want to play here. Vultures, wheeling silently above him, were the only living things as far as he could see. With this much devastation, they must have been feasting for days. He watched them, paralyzed by the sadness of the scene. The closest two were circling a hemlock bough near the bank, probably judging the safety of returning to the meal he had interrupted. A meal that might be... Pax couldn't form the thought, but he couldn't erase it either. If Pax had been here, he could be dead now. and if he was, the vultures would lead him to the proof. They hovered over 3 distinct spots, the one beside him and 2 across the river, slow and lazy, in no hurry. Their meals weren't going anywhere. He dropped his pack. Freed of the weight, he swung down the hemlock bough in only a few steps. Trailing beneath it was the sight he was dreading, a foxtail, its white-tipped brush unmistakable. He lifted the limb. The fox carcass had been scavenged, but its pelt remained. And it wasn't red. It wasn't red! Not Pax. He took a ragged breath. Dizzy with relief, he pegged down the river and waded in. When he was waist-high, the crutches skidded on some mud-slime stones, so he speared them over to the far bank and dove in. For the first time in 2 weeks, Peter didn't feel hampered by his broken foot. He swam strongly. He pulled himself onto the bank. Out of the water, the soaked cast felt like it weighed 100 pounds, the muddy plaster already crumbling. He took his knife out of his pocket and hacked it until he freed his foot. It hung pale and limp, but the swelling was down and the bruise was almost gone. Peter crawled to his crutches and hitched them under his arms. Upright, he saw what the larger group of vultures was circling. The corpse of a deer. He thought of the doe he'd seen in Vola's field. You humans, you ruin everything, and turned away from the sight. 20 yards up the field, a single vulture hovered over the 3rd spot he'd sighted. Peter climbed, choosing a path where the grasses had been burned, easier going. At first there seemed to be nothing on the charred ground, but when he was almost upon it, he saw a hind leg, fleshless and singed, but he knew it was a hind leg, a slim, black-furred hind leg with a small white paw. A ragged drift of fur at the top was bright cinnamon. Fox. Peter swayed on his crutches. Maybe it wasn't Pax's. Wasn't it too small to be Pax's? He wished he could know, and then he took back the wish. What did it matter anyway? A fox had been going about its life here, and some human had obliterated that life. Wasn't that enough of an outrage? He would scrape the earth with his bare hands and bury the remains. Peter dropped to the ground. He swept a wide circle bare of rubble, and his hand brushed something that turned the breath in his lungs to ash. A toy soldier, sighting down the barrel of a rifle, pressed tight to its hard green cheek, aiming at whatever happened to be in the way. Peter kneeled over. Pax! All right, we'll need to pause there. In my next read aloud, we will start at chapter 31 and finish the book. Hope to see you then. Bye-bye.